Year 8, this is Mr. Thomas holding the fort for Miss Streets. Once more, I am going to introduce you to a new text. Still with Gothic horror, we're going to move over to a writer called Edgar Allan Poe, quite a dark writer. That's to say, he writes about dark themes, death, psychiatric issues. However, if you understand how he works, I believe it'll make your creative writing very strong. So stay with us. On my list of words to review is adamant. So what does adamant mean? Have a moment to think, or listen to me. Adamant means you are certain of something, you're sure, you are confident that something's correct. So who was adamant that Elizabeth Proctor used witchcraft to stab her? This is a woman in the Crucible who arrives interrupts some men dining to claim that the needle she's pulled from her own stomach was placed there by witchcraft, by Elizabeth Proctor. Who was the woman who was stabbed? Any guesses? Begins with A, second word B, third word I. It's letter, I should say. Abigail. It's Abigail, the Proctor's servant, former servant. Recently, we looked at the idea of Faust. Who was Faust? You remember that he was the German scientist who sold his soul to a devilish character called Mephistopheles in return for all the knowledge and pleasure in the universe. But in what way is Dorian Gray a Faustian tale, therefore? Let's think about this. Think about what Dorian gains, something that no man is really allowed to gain, eternal youth. But what does he lose? What does he give away? And he gives away his reputation. He is overcome by guilt, and he damages his soul. So that's how his soul has been given away. Sociopath. Edgar Allan Poe writes about sociopaths, a sociopath in the story coming up. So, sociopath is a person with a personality disorder characterized by extreme antisocial attitudes. So, a sociopath is an extremely antisocial person. Bear that in mind. How do you expect a sociopath to approach someone who irritated them? So, what irritates you? Noise on the bus, noise on the train, litter, somebody opening a window in a classroom. Without asking you, how would you expect a sociopath to approach those people? Think about that. And in what way Dorian demonstrates sociopathic behavior? So remember the disreputable parts of London where Dorian has fun? Do you remember the women who have to leave the room when he enters? Or do you remember how Dorian deals with Basil in chapter 13? Today, you're going to analyse how Poe, I'll tell you about him shortly, presents the narrator's insanity in The Telltale Heart. We'll look at the first two paragraphs, a short scene, because I want to tell you about Edgar Allan Poe. Then we'll understand how he's an influential figure, how he changed the Gothic horror genre, and understand how he's considered the grandfather of the detective genre. What a mouthful. I'm going to give you this crossword to do. It'll be attached to our emails, and it'll show that you've listened, paid attention to this background. And then we're going to answer this question. How does Poe introduce a tone of insanity? How does Poe introduce a tone of insanity to the opening section of The Telltale Heart? Tone means atmosphere, in short. Basically how the writer gives you a feel of something. Comment on language and structure. Structure means refer to repeated words, punctuation marks, how a focus turns from one thing to the next. Language, very easy for you. Comment on why certain nouns, adjectives, and metaphors have been used. So, could you write the subheading, please, while I shut my door? Notes on Edgar Allan Poe. Very interesting writer. He's American. He was born in Boston, Massachusetts. If I spelled that wrong, please let me know. He's known for writing about mystery and the macabre. Macabre means gruesome, grisly, bloody, unsavory. So there it is. He's known for it, and we're going to look at least two of his works. One is a poem, and the other one today is a short story. In fact, they're two short stories. He is said to have invented the detective genre. Imagine that. Sherlock Holmes, James Bond, none of them would have existed if it wasn't for Edgar Allan Poe. So isn't he an important person to read about? Murders on the Rue Morgue was one of his, was the first detective story he wrote, a series of them. He is one of the central figures of what's called the American Renaissance, the American Rebirth. This was around 10 writers who changed the direction of American literature. And I think we're going to look at the Raven. Certainly we're going to look at the Telltale Heart. We'll look at the Black Cat as well. So his most famous works are the Raven and the Telltale Heart. I'm going to teach you a little bit about how he structured the Raven today, and in more detail when we come to look at the poem. He had a very methodical way of working, and I hope that learning about him will help you to plan your own work. His parents were actors, but his mother died when Edgar was 2 years old. The family broke up shortly afterwards, and Edgar actually lived with adoptive parents, although he wasn't formally adopted. He had a lot of fights with his father about money, but it's important to know for Croft, his parents were actors. He attended school in Scotland, actually, in England, so he had a classical education, it's called, and some of it comes through, we hope, in his stories. But then he went back to America in 1826. He was at the University of Virginia, remember that, but he had to leave because he was too poor. And then next year, he joins the army under the name Edgar Perry. So this is called an assumed name. I'm not too sure why. He just fancied calling himself Edgar Perry instead of Edgar Poe. But what happens? He wanted to leave the army, so purposefully sought to be expelled. He showed up late for parade all week and was thrown out. He moved to New York to write poems, and in New York writing poems, and then he went to Baltimore, where he began to write stories. Baltimore is another part of America. So poems in New York, then to Baltimore, and then he became the editor of not just one, but many magazines. He was fired from one, but was such an accomplished writer, he soon found work in other magazines, lifestyle magazines, gentlemen's magazines, the equivalent of something like Vogue or Tatler or GQ, perhaps. My goodness, what an awful spelling mistake. Virginia is the name. It's important to know that name. He married his cousin Virginia, who was incidentally 13. His cousin Virginia. She died, unfortunately, of tuberculosis. The poem The Raven, was published in 1945, and it brought him national fame. The Simpsons, does anyone out there know The Simpsons, the cartoon? They have parodied The Raven. Perhaps we could look at that parody in due course, but it's an iconic poem. What colour's a raven? What colour are ravens? Why is it a Gothic colour? Anyone? Ravens are black, so he's a Gothic creature. So what to expect from a Poe story? Oh, I should say that I have the slide somewhere, but there's a museum to the Poe family, to Edgar Allan Poe, which is in Richmond, Virginia. So the Poe Museum is in Richmond, Virginia. That slide will probably surprise us later. So what to expect from a Poe story? he was very meticulous, methodical about planning. He said, don't always think about the end of the story. Just think about the tone. Isn't that a clever way of approaching a story? So whatever you write, it has to have a certain tone. Today, the tone is going to be the tone of the insane. It's frantic turning in the background of my notes. He says, a story should be short enough to read in one sitting. You should think about the effects. Is it beauty? Is it death? What effect should you have on the reader? Do you want to make them sad all throughout? Do you want to create suspense? Have it in mind all the time, with every word, every sentence. Finally, he said, think about the tone. The tone is usually sadness, so usually sad stories, minute details, problem solving. The sociopath in the Telltale Heart is actually trying to solve the problem of how to deal with a man with a strange eye. And the application of Poe's strict rules for short stories. One of the rules was the story should be short enough to read in one sitting. I mentioned that you should think about the effect you want to have on the reader, think about the tone, and just keep that thread live. But crucially, he said, don't always think about the end. Just think about the effect instead. Virginia, yes, I mentioned that his wife died of tuberculosis. Poe died 2 years later in Baltimore. Mysterious circumstances, really. And yes, there's that surprise slide. The museum to him is in the Allen House in Richmond, Virginia. So could you write this subheading, please? How does Poe introduce a tone of madness to the opening section of Telltale Heart? We will read it together, make a few comments, and then I'll leave you to write 2 PEEs in addition to doing the crossword. So, how does Poe introduce a tone of madness to the opening section of Telltale Heart? I'll move on in 10 seconds. Then we'll go over to the document itself. Ready? Let's go. Jumping out of PowerPoint, jumping across to Word, and here we are. So you have this. We're going to read 2 paragraphs. First paragraph. It's a first-person narrative, a confessional narrative of somebody who is about to do something, explain how he does something macabre. True, nervous, very, very dreadfully nervous I've been and am, but why will you say that I'm mad? The disease has sharpened my senses, not destroyed, not dulled them. Above all was the sense of hearing acute, which means sharp. I heard all things in the heaven and in the earth. I heard many things in hell. How then am I mad? Hearken. Do you know what hearken means? It means listen. Remember Animal Farm, hearken to my joyful tidings. And observe how healthily, how calmly I can tell you the whole story. I was going to stop there, but we'll look at the next paragraph as well, just to show you what was upsetting this chap. It's impossible to say how first the idea entered my brain, but once conceived it haunted me day and night. Object there was none, passion there was none. I loved the old man. He'd never wronged me. He'd never given me insult. For his gold I had no desire. He didn't want to mug him, rob him. I think it was his eye. Yes, it was this. He had the eye of a vulture, a pale blue eye with a film over it. Whenever it fell upon me, my blood ran cold. So by degrees, very gradually, I made up my mind to take the life of the old man, and thus rid myself of the eye forever. So, are we dealing with a sociopath here? I think so, but let's look at some notes. Dreadfully nervous. Let's make a comment. Dreadfully. Yes. He has lost control. There's a tone of aware of my nerves. Not destroyed, not dulled. Miss Street, I think, calls these emeralds or dashes. There are quite a few of them, you'll notice. So it creates this effect called caesura, which means, does anyone know what this means? If you've made yourself sound clever to your parent or friend, or to yourself. Caesura means a pause. Caesura means pause, creates the effect of hesitation or uncertainty. Or inner turmoil, if you like. The sense that the memory is causing him pain. Remember the question asks you about how does the tone of madness come through. I heard many things in hell. Hell. Well, tormented by a sound or thought. Perhaps I'd heard many things in hell, so he's actually claiming to have seen the underworld. How then? Am I mad? Hearken, look at the question mark. Uncertainty. It's his sanity. Indeed that he isn't. Doubt his sanity or claiming to be sane. It's up to you to interpret either one. Hearken and observe how healthily, how calmly I can tell you the whole story. So it's almost suggesting that he has a reason to be upset. His eye, exclamation mark. So let's make a structural point here. Remember, I've asked you to comment on not just the language, but how things are arranged. This is arranged with an exclamation mark. The exclamation mark shows how the memory excites or horrifies him. It's driven him mad. Grated on his nerves. His eye, that eye, the eye of a vulture. This is a metaphor to give the old man a ghoulish quality, isn't it? The eye of a vulture. Anyway, you get the idea. Now, let me go back to PowerPoint now. I'll show you a couple of models and leave you to write your own PE. I suggest you write one on language and one on structure. Now, I know some people in my class are going to do this quite well from what I've seen. So if you are those people, you know who you are, then please answer this question. If not, then I would suggest you. So here's an example of what you could say. Poe introduces a tone of madness when. Notice I've repeated the question in my opening statement. Poe introduces a tone of madness when the narrator describes hearing hell. I've embedded a single word quotation into that first sentence. All we need. The noun, is the terminology, presents successfully a traumatic event that is used to justify what must be a horrific act to come. So I'm saying the writer says, well, don't blame me for killing this chap. I could hear hell. It was hell to listen to him or to see him. The noun presents successfully. Well, you could use vividly, powerfully, or dramatically, but successfully is really the stock phrase, or effectively, those two adverbs will do. Poe introduced a tone of madness with the repeated use of dashes. I've included emeralds as an alternative, a description of dashes as a tribute to, to honor Miss Street's description. This caesura presents the narrator as confused and anxious. Remember what caesura means? A pause. Presents the narrator as confused and anxious, perhaps because the memory of the event he's describing is traumatic. Always try to ask yourself why characters are behaving as they are. So because the memory of the event he's describing is traumatic. Have I showed you this crossword already? If not, here it is. you should have this as an attachment. Fill out that. If you're stuck for any of the gaps, rewind the video, and you have this question to answer as well, which I've shown you how to do with 2 examples. So 1 paragraph on structure, 1 on language, and a crossword, and you're done. Next time we will push forward on Edgar Allan Poe. Who is this man? And his story, The Telltale Heart. So what early clue can you identify that the narrator is a psychopath? Sorry, sociopath. Okay, on that note, see you next time.